Dan's works with an amazing organization, one that at Worth Media Group we have only been learning more and more about in the last 6 to 12 months. Dan's with the Milken Institute, Michael Milken's organization, and his current title is Senior Director of the Milken Institute Center for Financial Markets. And he runs, in particular, a program, Climate Resilient Infrastructure and Public Finance. Milken Institute is involved, Dan, in a whole lot of things. And I mentioned in my opening comments about I'm keenly interested in the overlap between the philanthropic sector, government, and private industry. And you cross into all those lanes in the work that you do. By background, Dan has worked in the climate space for a long time, and he's worked for and advised Governors Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom of California on all things related to climate. And you're also on the executive committee of the U.S. Climate Alliance. So you know this space cold. You also worked in the Obama administration in the Department of Energy, where you ran the State Energy Advisory Board. So you know this space well. What I'd ask first is, do I have it right about the interlocking relationships between philanthropy, where you're rooted now, but philanthropy working to get governments to do their piece on what they can do best in this solve? Do I have that essentially right? And do we have the right balance there right now?
Yeah, I mean, getting the harmonics right between government, private sector, philanthropy, and communities where these projects need to happen is, I think, one of the big challenges of our time. I mean, I consider myself a professional optimist, but we didn't quite rip the Band-Aid off at COP28. We're not really going to make our 2030 midterm targets.
And you're a big proponent of we should rip that Band-Aid and
yeah, I think we just need to say it's not going to happen that way. I think there's a way to get to 2050 in a way that we could reach, and some of the topics on technology are a part of that. But it's also, I think, honestly, we tend to sort of lock in, and this is our plan. So a lot of what we're focused in on is how do we get those harmonics right over the next decade, 2025 to 2035. How do we get public finance, the so-called unlocking of private capital, and increasingly important is how do you get community leaders and philanthropic leaders to be at the table. So as we move from the situation now where the conversation around climate tends to be big utility scale solar and wind and some storage, which is important, but there's not really that many big projects, and it's a lot more in a world of distributed technology, smaller scale, community scale projects, whether for frontline communities and island nations that are literally on the front line of that threat, or underserved populations in the US that are experiencing floods and other challenges like this. So, I think the conversation tends to be this, big conversation around climate, and we need to unlock trillions of dollars in capital and slideshows, which are important, but getting into the weeds of how we're going to unpack that and recalibrate investment and partnership is critical.
So at the Milken Institute, with your work, how do you look at your success? You're coming from the philanthropic space, but you're trying to be a ringleader. You're trying to orchestrate, and you're trying to get the other two circles, the government circle, which can bring big industrial size funding and get things started, but they don't continue properly unless there's a good economic reason, therefore private sector involvement. So you got the baton in your hand. What is it you're trying to achieve from looking at this from a new financial paradigm? How do you try and balance those interests? What do each of those sectors do best, and what are you trying to get them to do?
Yep. So, we've got 3 major initiatives that we're trying to move as a catalyst around. So one is around this issue of where are the projects? How do we have projects? It's sort of a joke, where's the pipeline? You'll hear at meetings like this. So we're testing out something in the US, very focused on how do we help 10,000 underserved communities in the US build a community-led economic development, clean economy projects that they want. And one of the things that we've learned is the absence of pre-development capital. International folks might think of it as de-risking capital. It is the equity risk capital to make a project happen. So there's a lot of planning money you can get. There's a lot of low-cost loans, but 5 to 10% of a project, you have to get a feasibility study, you have to get site control, and a bunch of nerdy things like that. So that pre-development piece is super important, and we built a platform to connect communities with capital providers of all types, and also developers. So a lot of climate tech developers and others coming in. So we think over time, if we get this right in the next 3 to 5 years with this platform, with the regional trainings we do around the country, we can bundle together smaller projects. Think of, there's 1,000 wastewater treatment plants, the biggest energy user in communities. They've been around since the 70s. They're the largest energy hog. As we solve a way to have 20 of those $30 million retrofits done, we can go to the $32 trillion asset owners network that comes to the Milken Global Conference and say, you say you can't write a check below $200 million. We get that. Here's a bundle of projects with return, and it also becomes offtake. So we're recycling the philanthropic de-risking capital and the government de-risking capital to make and close that private financing gap we know that's out there.
Well, I know your CEO, Rich DeTizio, and Michael Milken both are nuts about metrics. They have a big philanthropic consulting practice there, about 100 people, I think it is, that work with families that want to create foundations or existing foundations that want to be more efficient and help them to orchestrate their resources with other groups with like interests. But they're all about measurement and accountability. What kind of measurement and accountability tools do they want you to impose on that process so you know that 5-year pre-development effort is on track and people are being held to their task?
Yep. So on that one, we've got a roadmap for how do we reach and provide free technical assistance for underserved communities. We've touched about 700 now. We're on a path that looks pretty good. I think the most important metric relates to our second big area of work, which is unpacking the notion that we're going to accelerate the energy transition. At some level, it's a Rorschach inkblot. People say and think whatever they think it is, whether you're the head of an oil company or you're a climate tech person. And so how do you unpack that? And the metric that we're really trying to push forward is when Mike Wirth or another oil company CEO is on stage and says, we're committed to net zero by 2050, that's fantastic. But how are you showing your work between now and 2030, 2035?
So don't talk to me until 2051, right?
Yeah, or talk to you until 2051. So for example, there are companies, Chevron among them, have they made a business unit investment? And whether it's carbon capture or new forms of biofuels, et cetera, the more we can get specific with major companies that need to drive this ship and encourage them that you've made a real investment, that's, I think, an important metric at this point. Otherwise, we're just talking at a very general level.
Mm-hmm. I saw George before from the aquarium here. I wonder what role do you see the ocean playing here? There's a couple of folks in the audience who are really keen on harnessing the reparative powers of the oceans to help us. Any of the projects on your radar screen helping there?
Well, look, I think there's a range of very promising, what I call 5G climate tech solutions, whether for oceans or other things that are very, very promising. I think we need to remember we have a lot of 1G technology that we've not deployed in housing and building and regenerative ag, et cetera. So I think the key, that's part of the reason we're trying to build, and we'll be having discussions at Milken Global next month around this, on the road to 2035, what's the missing pre-development, what are the sectors that make sense, and fundamentally how we drive this conversation down to a very regional, local level, because in general, that's where projects are sourced, the conditions are different, and place that too much water, not enough water, water coming up on their island. So I think we need to get very specific about it. So the promise is there, but I think it's also understanding, we get excited about 5G climate tech, but in the near term, how do we deploy what we have? I think the other thing I would say is in this current moment, we are looking at a situation where how we deal with the realities we have to take critically important. So another third major initiative that we have is what we call our RAMP initiative, Resilience and Adaptation Mobilization Partnership. The effects of climate change are hitting now, and we really need to ramp up public spending to help make sure, A, we help communities that are facing things now, and B, how we bank the net present value of that savings. If we invest in resilience and adaptation.
So you can recycle that capital?
Can recycle and use it for mitigation tech. We don't really know what scales right now. We know about utility scale solar and wind, storage, a few other areas, but the presupposition that there's public dollars available to de-risk, do research, et cetera, is a huge presupposition as you think about fiscal challenges, US and abroad. So we want to make sure we can bank that money and have that kind of mitigation banking available. But in the near term, we've got to address the massive losses that we have. And one source for doing this, I think our friends at the Climate Policy Initiative estimated that $64 billion of global public and private finance went to adaptation in the most recent year. About $1 trillion has gone to oil and gas subsidies. So can we move that pie chart around a little bit? It's been a nice ride, oil and gas. You've had your subsidies, arguably for nuclear and other older technologies. If we're going to subsidize and catalyze markets, public sector is the first money. That pre-development dollars is the first money, and we can't forget that.
Also seems to me that we've been reading in the last couple of months in particular about with the fracking boom here, which has given us the opportunity to be energy independent for the first time, we're also leaking gas dramatically. Shouldn't there be some infrastructure that captures that? Because it seems like A, we're not harnessing it, and B, it's doing damage.
No, 100%. I mean, I think the EDF launch of methane sat is great news. I think in general, I think it's 50% of the product is lost, and that's costing money. So I think we'll make progress there. I think there's also, an understanding now that if we're going to make our numbers by 2050, I mean, right now we're burning up 2 gigatons of forest every year. That's like 5% of the annual amount of gigatons that we're emitting. So we need to address that problem. But I think there's also a real understanding that we're going to have to do something with carbon capture, carbon management, et cetera, whether it's Bill Gates's blocks underground or whatever happens. That's super important. But I think as we look about the pricing issue and carbon pricing and voluntary carbon markets, those signals which are really important, the politics of them are tough. Right now we know, and Dan Costa was mentioning that New York Times article about carbon engineering, carbon capture is roughly $200 to $1,000 a ton to do. Mm-hmm. And we know, everyone agrees, that we're going to have to take a pie slice of about 10 to 15% out of the carbon to make 2050. So there's a reference point, if you will, for pricing. So right now, in the nature world and debt for nature world, people fight over, well, is that tree planting solution or is that ocean blue solution? Is it $8 or it's going to be $20 return? If we know the reference point is way up here, I know that we have to be hard-nosed investors, but we need to understand if something is good that's costing under $50 a ton, how do we make sure that we're not fighting over the details and understanding there's a sensitivity range and benefits there, et cetera. So I think how we attack the pricing conversation, I think, should be anchored in this understanding we're going to have to remove carbon, so let's build a pricing system that can, as that price comes down or as that gets subsidized, need to make sure that other solutions, which are a little less scary to do and maybe hard to do, are given a fair chance in the market.
You've been at this a long time, Dan. You know it so well. Back when you were advising the governors here in California, is there a project that you didn't get done that you wish you had gotten done, and might there have been a benefit to date if it had happened?
I mean, I think, a lot of what's been happening in California that I is very excited about, it took a while. The state, I think, has come to realize that their dollar is catalytic. The state doesn't have to do anything. They're simply a capital provider. And so, for example, we've seen the state start to budget differently, both how do we unlock the federal dollars, but also how do we get the private sector involved. So for a long time, I think the state was spending, like, fully funding green buildings and other things when they didn't really have to. And I think that under both Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom and folks at the Department of Finance, I think of my friend Gail Miller, who's now at Brookfield, have really shifted the state's budgeting to be that catalytic pre-development dollar to shift that. So I think the aircraft carrier of California, led by Arnold Schwarzenegger, followed by Jerry and Gavin, I think is really now moving to be an innovator in private finance rather than just we decide what the projects are. And I think that's been a big shift. And
what role do you at the Milken Institute play in terms of advising and coaching and steering the different entities to get the right outcomes?
So the main thing that we do, I go on the road a lot. We have an incredible team that runs our community infrastructure, and then we do these 10,000 communities events where we go to rural areas. We were just in New Mexico, we were just in Michigan, we've been in the Northwest, we've been in the Southeast, where we bring together all the cross-sectoral players, kind of, you know, preach the gospel, if you will, that it isn't one federal grant, but this is a blended finance problem. We're going to, in emerging market America, we need to blend dollars together. Hey, local philanthropy. Hey, cities. Hey, counties. Hey, states. Your dollar is catalytic. And if you set your projects up in the right way and you set your systems up in the right way, involve developers early, because a lot of climate developers, it used to be you could just go to your utility, knock on the door, I've got a PPA for you, power purchase agreement, easy peasy. Now you got to get messy in communities. So what we're trying to do is sort of teach this work and get people to have what my friend Trenton Allen calls patient urgency. You know, it's going to take a while to make this shift. This money is going to be here for a while, and having carrots rather than sticks as the way to build markets is how we're going to unlock private capital.
We were talking before, you're very familiar with good things that are going on in Detroit, and you talked about Dan Gilbert and the Kresge Foundation. Anything there they're doing from a climate perspective that you think is really noteworthy?
Yeah, I think we just had an event. Governor Whitmer has got a great new team. They have a new Michigan infrastructure office that has basically put up a $300 million innovation fund. They want to attract AI. They want to steal smart people from Mountain View and California to come out and build the next energy future there.
Wait, there are smart people here in Mountain View?
I'm told. I've heard rumors. I've heard rumors. And so I think they understand that they've set up the budgeting to say, we will support workforce. They have a great program that is pulling together, you know, they just had a big DOE loan announcement there for major investment in a new chip plant. And they are also very focused on how do we have a diverse supply chain so that, you know, it is black and brown faces and developers are at the table from the get-go, not as an afterthought, which is very cool.
It'd be interesting to see the social impact of the Intel plant in Ohio. I think it's going to be extraordinary.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Are we keeping score the right way as you suggest, we rip the Band-Aid off, get focused on 2050, 2035? Are we looking at the right indicators?
Well, look, I consider myself post-PowerPoint. I trade in cartoons that I share when I give presentations. And so, you know, we all know the hockey stick curve of revenues. I think there's a curve around outcomes. And right now, we're just in this period of time where, you know, getting project pipeline together, getting new ways to organize capital together makes it feel like we're stuck. We are going to hockey stick, but you can't skip over the step of de-risking projects. I always give this example. EPA has these brownfield grants where only the public sector is going to rehabilitate a contaminated site so that development can come in. So I think we're going to sort through this period over the next period of time, but we just can't skip that step. So I think that outcomes metric becomes an understanding it's going to be slow at first as we retool how we blend finance together. The other big metric is understanding and unpacking where the action is. We get super excited, and we should, about the Inflation Reduction Act and the bill and the CHIPS and all the federal dollars flowing, but every year, 2/3 of infrastructure in the U.S. is funded at the state and local level largely by muni bonds, and muni bonds are a great tool. However, muni bonds need a lot of reforms. They basically, we fund the low-cost capital bit, and then we wonder how we're going to maintain and building an asset meant the last 30 or 40 years. So more life cycle accounting, very good for climate and climate resilience, is another area that we nibble at because it's a tough problem.
May 6th, you mentioned, is the beginning of the Milken Global Conference in Los Angeles. You have 6,000 impactful people from around the world coming together. What's on the agenda vis-a-vis climate?
Well, I'm proud to say we've got a record number of programs and panels, both public and private, on energy and climate resilience. For my part, I'm hopeful that we can really put in the ground some thinking around 2025 to 2035, unpack public and private, look at different regions we can go to, think in very clear terms like, can we bring more private finance through Baku into Brazil in 2025 when that COP happens, lift up debt for nature, resilience and adaptation? Because I think getting, in my mind, if we could increase spending on resilience and adaptation 5x from where it is now, that would close what is estimated as a $1.8 trillion investment gap, and it will also generate about $10 trillion in economic activity. If we can, with smart people, smarter than me, think about how we can bank that savings, the infrastructure asset risk that is in the existing
more self-funding.
More self-funding, everybody wins.
Well, thanks for sharing your knowledge with us, Dan. We look forward to what happens on May 6th. And a little commercial announcement, Worth is a proud media partner of the Milken Global Conference this year. And we have a special issue with a couple of interesting cats on the cover that you know. So look forward to seeing you there and seeing your work at the Milken Global Conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.